The tip that led to the arrest and conviction of Ed Edwards came from his own daughter.
Just because I had a lot of characteristics of my father, it didn't mean that I was going to go out and kill people or even harm people.
He was in our bedroom. He attacked me with a club to go ahead, I believe, and kill me because he left no witnesses and he left no one alive.
He had a habit of biting his victims and leave extremely distinct teeth patterns. Just before he was caught, he had all of his teeth pulled.
I knew John Gacy, as everybody else in the community knew him, as a trustworthy, decent, good guy who was a clown and active in a political organization.
But today, decades-old evidence is revealing new details about a possible suspect.
A lot of people thought this was going to be a passing fancy back in the 90s even, after Silence of the Lambs came out. 90% of the audience are women.
Hi, I'm John Carney, and this is The Theme Machine. And every episode comes at you with something completely different, and this time, no exception. It was just a matter of time before we waded into the field of true crime and serial killers in particular. And to say that we have an obsession with murder is more than an understatement. While investigating the matter, if you will, I found that the internet lists over 500 true crime TV shows, and well over half of Americans are obsessed with it. Full disclosure, I'm one of them. Pouring through the archives, I found that not only has true crime been a frequent subject matter in my interviews, but many of them have focused on the serial killer in particular. By definition, a serial killer murders two or more people with a cooling off period in between. Some are well known, some are not, some have killed a couple, and some have claimed to have murdered hundreds. The actual number of these deviants is unknown, as many haven't been caught. But as of a few years ago, there were at least 4,000 of them in the U.S. alone. This episode of The Theme Machine will focus on some of the bigger cases through the words of their families, their surviving victims, and even people tasked with defending them for their crimes. It's serial killers this time on The Theme Machine. First up, Edward Edwards, who from 1977 to the mid-90s was responsible for killing at least 5 people. He's suspected of dozens more. Killing his own foster son to collect insurance money, among other crimes. Other victims included young couples, dubbing those the sweetheart murders. And our first perspective on this subject comes from a very personal place indeed. The killer's very child, April Balascio, felt her childhood was like any other. But as she got older, she began to suspect some things. In fact, it was her suspicions that helped put Edward Edwards behind bars. Boy, I'm sorry that was part of your childhood. You know, and I talked to the kids of famous people too, and they're like, no, it didn't seem like a strange upbringing because it was my only frame of reference. But that point when you connected some dots and realized this was not typical, and the moving in the middle of the night, and boy, look at these crimes that occurred in places where we lived around the country. Describe that moment when that possibility first crept into your mind?
The scales started coming off of my eyes when I was in 6th grade up in Wisconsin after another couple had come up missing. At that time, we didn't realize they were murdered, and we actually left Wisconsin before we had heard that they were murdered. But I remember my dad just being obsessed with these 2 missing young people, and he would talk about them constantly. And I remember thinking, why? Is he obsessed with this? And then it made me think about all the other places that we lived where young people came up missing or found murdered, and my brain started to think about these things. But that's when the wheels started turning, and that's also when my relationship with my dad started going by the wayside. I was daddy's little girl, and then through all the abuse, that love relationship turned into like a love-hate relationship.
I would think that inner turmoil for you of, do I tell somebody about this, or do I protect the man who raised me, had to be a very difficult internal conversation.
It is easier to come forward now, whereas when I was growing up, it wasn't. So even though I might have had a desire to talk to someone, I knew that I couldn't. There was just no way that I would have talked to someone. And I didn't even mention things until maybe when I was a senior in high school, I mentioned it to a girlfriend, but it was more so after I got married and I started sharing some things with my husband.
And eventually it was a tip to police that tracked them to him and got him arrested for this series of crimes. But rewind a bit, April, did you ever look your father in the eyes when you started to suspect and say, Dad, did you do this?
I never confronted him. And when I turned him in, when I, made that initial phone call in 1980, by that time, I had definitely cut off all communication. I had tried multiple times to have a relationship with my dad, but he just kept doing things that made it impossible. He knew it was me, even without anyone telling him. He did reach out to me once after his arrest. He sent a message in the mail. When I opened it, it said something to the effect of, keep this because it will be worth a lot of money someday. And then he had a scrap piece of paper with his signature on it. And I was just appalled. So that was the only communication I had, if you want to call it communication, with my dad in years.
So today, and even for a long time, there have been armchair sleuths that want to solve a crime that they've got nothing to do with and connect the dots, and they've figured out what happened here and what happened to that and where Jimmy Hoffa's body is and whatever it is. So I would think that call to police was one of thousands that they get where they say, I know somebody who killed somebody. So did you have trouble being believed initially?
He did think I was a crackpot. Here he's thinking this is a daughter that has a grudge against her dad. She's from out of town. But what he was doing, even though he had those initial thoughts, what he was doing was he had turned on his computer and he started typing in different things and realizing the names that I gave, like my dad's name was on the list of having been interviewed. There was a campground by the Concord House. So he's realizing that things that I'm saying are aligning with the things that are in the file. Credit to him, he still continued. He did his investigating and found out that those things were true. And, it eventually led to the arrest of my dad.
April Balascio with us, her book now out, Raised by a Serial Killer, Discovering the Truth About My Father. The term product of your environment, that was something else I was very curious about with you. Moving forward and going on to have a normal life and get married and have a family and work and refinish furniture and do all the things that most of us have done and enjoyed as well. Does the thought still ever creep into your mind about the genetics of who you are? And when you get angry at somebody, think, oh, now I got to keep that in check.
Yes, I did question the characteristics that I inherited from my dad, and I spent many years trying to suppress them. Just because I had a lot of the characteristics of my father, it didn't mean that I was going to go out and kill people or even harm people.
April Balascio, daughter of Edward Edwards, on the Theme Machine. Authorities believe that without her tip, he may have never been caught. We'll hear from more people who have had encounters with some of these madmen in a bit. But first, a bit of science. Dr. Kent Keil is a neuroscientist who's made it his life's work to study the minds of these people. The research has been thorough, and with advanced technology, the findings have been interesting.
We built a very state-of-the-art, one-of-a-kind MRI, and we put it in a trailer. I know the jokes are coming. I live in New Mexico, and I have a trailer, but it's a very nice trailer. We've taken that thing to 8 prisons in 2 states and scanned over 3,000 inmates, about 500 of whom are psychopaths or met criterion for the condition. And, yeah, we've actually found that their brains are very different using those techniques.
So talk about what's happened when you've put the MRI to the human brain, especially a damaged one. What did you see that was different than maybe yours if it was in this machine?
Well, the difference is that in the psychopathic individual, the limbic areas of the brain, the emotional regions of the brain, the older kind of very important areas that help to regulate emotions and impulsivity and things, they're about 5 to 10% weaker. That is, they have a kind of like a weakened muscle, if you will. And it appears that we've been able to show that these effects are found as early as age 12, 13, 14 in our most recent studies. And so this would suggest that there's some sort of a neurobiological component to this condition. That is, they likely would be born with some sort of vulnerability, and then in the right environmental circumstances, it can manifest as these types of symptoms and behavior that we call psychopathic.
The question of nature versus nurture also comes up in these conversations about who's psychopathic and who isn't. And what pops into my mind were some of the interviews that I saw done with Jeffrey Dahmer's parents. And they seem very loving. They seem very caring. Yet they raised a son who decided to eat people. How much of it have you found has been about where you came from, and how much of it is these are the cards you were dealt and this is what's going to happen from the minute you came out of the womb?
Yeah, I think most parents that we've worked with or interviewed would say that the child was very different from their other kids, their other children as well, and that they tried their best, they did their best, and they don't know why they ended up like this. And that's by far the more common story, because psychopaths come from all walks of life, and it's even more surprising when they come from like good environmental circumstances where they had good parenting and good help and good resources, and yet they continued on this path, and it really mystified people. That's one of the things that I think really captures public attention, is you might have somebody who you can't understand why they might do these things. They didn't come from an abusive family, for example, or anything like that. And so it's really complicated in the sense that they can come from normal environments and yet have this really, really, really profoundly disturbed personality, and that's really hard to try to understand.
So does that mean, at least in your belief, that a lot of this is in your DNA strand from the very beginning?
Yeah, the research, actually, I would quote work from collaborators in the UK who have shown that at least 50% of the traits appear to be inherited or genetic, if you will. And that's similar to other psychiatric conditions. So we don't think that psychopaths are that different from many other conditions in the sense that how much of the traits are explained by genetics.
Let's talk about treatment and your work in this, life's work in identifying psychopaths has been amazing. But on a rehabilitation scale, is it your belief that these people could be rehabilitated to the point of once again becoming productive members of society?
But I think the jury's still out. I don't think we've really tried to develop the best treatments and implement them in adults. And so I think that that's something that we should do, and hopefully if we did do it, it would prevent us from having these types of news-related activities and serial murderers and other types of things from occurring. That's our big focus, is to try to develop and prevent these things from happening rather than just reacting and having to go through capital cases and trials and other types of things.
You can read more on Dr. Keil's findings in his 2014 book, The Psychopathic Whisper. It's the Theme Machine. I'm John Carney, and this time we turn our attention to serial killers. This topic has remained of great interest to the public, and no killer has captured society's interest more than Jeffrey Dahmer. After his arrest in 1991, we learned that not only was he responsible for the deaths of more than 17 people, but he stored many of their body parts and even ingested them. 2 years after his sentencing, Dahmer was beaten to death by a fellow inmate, so not many people got to hear from him. One who did was fellow inmate Herman Martin, who was briefly housed in an adjoining cell. And stories between the two were shared in a book called Serial Killer Soul, co-written by author Patricia Lorenz.
Cells are concrete block, and Herman would stand on the sink in his cell and talk through the air vent above the sink, which went into Dahmer's cell next door. And they could talk pretty privately. There were only 5 cells on that cell block and a shower. And Dahmer's cell was across from the shower, and then Herman's was right next to his. And so the other 3 men who hated Dahmer, as did most of the prisoners in that institution, Herman and Dahmer would talk in the evenings, late at night, and Dahmer would listen, and it took a while for this relationship to begin. But
so did Herman ever express to you fear and concern for his own safety by befriending this vilified killer?
I I think that's one reason they tried to keep it really quiet at night. They would talk late at night and kind of whisper through this vent, and Dahmer, or Herman would read him long passages from the Bible, and he asked him a lot of questions about his crimes, and I think Herman was extremely curious about the crimes, as were, I'm sure, all the other prisoners. But then he led into his, spewing of faith and sharing his faith. And to answer your question, I don't know. I don't know how that affected his relationship with the other prisoners.
Yeah, and I don't know either. I would be a little jumpy talking to someone that I know would just assume eat me.
Well, and in the end, Dahmer was murdered by a prisoner there,
right?
Who I think a couple of years after he was incarcerated, and Dahmer got tired of being isolated, and he wanted to work. He wanted a job in the prison, and he got a job finally cleaning the bathrooms, I think, around the gymnasium, and that was his downfall. And the guy that killed him, I'm sure, was a little crazy.
What was Herman's motivation in doing so? Was it to convert Jeffrey? Was it to get the story and maybe publish down the road?
I think both. I think he is honorable enough and his faith is strong enough.
We're learning of Herman Lee Martin, who wrote the book along with our guest Patricia Lorenz, but also learning of Jeffrey Dahmer as it was chronicling the conversations between Jeffrey and Herman.
Quite honestly, when I was finished with the book, and I did a lot of research on my own, I interviewed the detective who was present for all 24 hours of the Dahmer interviews before Dahmer went to trial. I went down to the jail in Milwaukee where Dahmer was placed, before and during the trial. I called the warden in the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, where Dahmer ended up, and talked to him about life in the prison. So when I started writing the book based on Herman's notes that he had scribbled, on legal paper in prison, and all the Bible verses that he used when he talked to Dahmer, and all the conversations they had, and even letters that they wrote back and forth to each other.
What was the time frame of their conversations? How long did he get to befriend Jeffrey before he was killed?
He was only in the cell next to Dahmer for about 3 months. But then after he left, they sent Herman down to Racine, Wisconsin, to another prison. He did correspond with Jeffrey a number of times after he left Columbia Correctional Institution, and they have letters that they wrote back and forth. And I think I've seen copies of the letters, and Dahmer's letters were pretty sincere, kind of short, but just staying in touch. And they had the feel that there definitely was a friendship that had developed during those 3 months when they were together every day.
Did he feel that he made that progress, and was there a turning point where he felt that he had reached Jeffrey?
I think there was a lot of back and forth feeling in Herman's heart. He kept it up night after night, and he would start out with a normal conversation that you would expect between two men, in this situation, asking Jeffrey questions about the individual crimes. And Herman, I believe, was pretty convinced that Dahmer was a racist. And I actually interviewed a number of people, including this detective who sat in on all the hours of interviews with Jeffrey Dahmer before his trial, this detective said he did not think that Dahmer was racially prejudiced because he didn't, his murder victims were not any one race. You'll see in the book that in some places Dahmer got irritated when they were talking, and he would act like he was the worst racist in the world. But, just because I think he wanted to make Herman upset, or he wanted to give in to Herman's belief.
I'm a little stunned that Jeffrey Dahmer was reticent to admit being a racist, yet totally comfortable to admitting to killing and eating 17 people.
He didn't eat 17 people. That's a whole misnomer. He was interested in he did cut up the bodies, but I read somewhere that he only actually tasted one
piece of one liver.
That doesn't make it any better.
And people call him a cannibal, and I don't think that was it. I know, you're right, it doesn't. But
did Herman get the answer to the one question that most of us would have? Like, why did you do that?
Well, it goes back and forth in their conversations. You know, like I say, I think some nights Dahmer was just tired and fed up, and he knew that Herman thought that he was a racist, and so he would say, "Yeah, it's my job to annihilate all the blacks in the world." And yet, I don't think Dahmer really meant that, because in the next night he would say something totally different. And my feeling is based on what that detective said, who was present for all of the intense interviews that they did of Jeffrey Dahmer before his trial. And my belief is that he was not particularly prejudiced against any one race. And why he did that? Who knows? God only knows why he did what he did.
I'm John Carney, and this is The Theme Machine. This time, it's serial killers. Another one that's always mentioned is John Wayne Gacy. His story is the making of nightmares. Almost 30 bodies found under his house. A pillar of the community and a part-time clown for children's birthdays. Not only was the public unaware of his misdeeds, but so was the man who had defended him, Sam Amarante. And you had come from the public defender's office, and was this not your first case?
He was my first case in private practice. He actually knew me. He called the public defender's office looking for me. I had just resigned, opened up my new law office, hanging up pictures, hanging up my shingle, and I get a call. Said, "Hey, Sam, can you do me a favor? It's John Gacy." I said, "No problem. What do you need, John?" You can find out why I'm being tailed by the police. They're ruining my business. They're destroying my life and everything. I said, "Oh, no problem. I know all those guys. I'll find out." I was in the middle of my first case in private practice.
At what point does it all come out? There's 30-plus bodies in this guy's basement, and this man is a monster, and you're kind of on the hook to represent him.
Yeah, well, initially, I just thought he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he was being tailed, just a suspect in a missing boy's disappearance. He happened to be at the place where the boy was, and I knew John Gacy, as everybody else in the community knew him, as a trustworthy, decent, good guy who was a clown and active in a political organization. Nobody suspected him of anything. That was the scariest thing about him. So I was going under the premise that he was just being harassed. And the harassment was becoming greater and greater as the few days went by. And he was giving me the same old line of crap that, he was at the store, he didn't know anything about it, and blah, blah, blah. And I was finding out a little more about it, as a lawyer should do. I was investigating it, trying to talk to the prosecutor, who wouldn't give me much information, but I got a little at a time.
So at what point do you realize that this man that you know has indeed done these things?
I was getting more and more aggravated with him, because then I started thinking he was lying to me, and he just wasn't being forthright with everything. And one day he called me, and he told me he had something else to tell me, and I laid into him, and I said, look, I don't want to hear the same old garbage from you, John. I'm tired of hearing this same old thing. I'm tired. I'm aggravated. And he said, "No, I really have to tell you something. It's important." So I made arrangements to meet me at my office late at night, and we met with him, and he went through the same old stuff, telling me the same old thing again, and I got furious. And I had a newspaper with a picture of the boy in the newspaper in my conference room. Threw the paper down on the table, and I started pounding on the paper and pounding on the table with my fist and pointing at the kid's picture. I said, "John, this kid is missing. Evidence is pointing that you know something about it. Tell me the truth." I started yelling and screaming at him. And he was not an intimidating guy, and he sort of looked at me like a little puppy dog. And then he looked at the picture, and he said, "This boy in this picture is dead, but he's not the boy that was in the drugstore. This boy's in the Des Plaines River." And I'm like, "What?" He said, "He's dead. He's in the Des Plaines River." I said, "What are you talking about?" Then he asked me if I had anything to drink, and I happened to have a bottle of VO that I got as a Christmas present. I poured him a little bit. He asked me to fill up the whole coffee cup. I filled it up. He chugged it down. He wanted more. I filled it up again. He chugged it down. Then he looked at me, eyeball to eyeball, and he said, "I've been the judge, jury, and executioner of many, many people. Now I want to be my own judge, jury, and executioner." Now, this time I'm thinking Gacy's a liar anyway, and he's making up stuff. And then he went into this story that started in 1972 when he picked a kid up at the Greyhound bus station in Chicago. For the next 6 hours, 5 or 6 hours, in detail, vividly described every murder that took place in his house, where he buried the bodies in his house and around his property, where he dumped them into the Plains River, how he did it, and it was just the most horrible night. But eventually he fell asleep, and all we could think of, we have to get a hold of a doctor to get this guy in, a psychiatrist, and do something, because he told us it would be if it ever happened again, he was going to build a second story in his house because he was getting tired of going to the Des Plaines River. It was too inconvenient for him to bring the bodies over there.
I know as a barrister, you have a sworn obligation to provide everybody due process. But I just don't see how you couldn't, after hearing that story, walk away and say, you know what, you don't deserve due process.
I never really had time to think about it. I was just from an ethical viewpoint, I was scared.
What did this do to your world and your family and your practice?
Changed my whole life around. It turned my life upside down.
Judge Amarante, who at the time just coming out of the DA's office and hanging up a shingle for the first time, and this would be his first case, I would think kind of like the way an astronaut feels after a trip to the moon, that, well, from that point on, there's not really going to be another case. This, although sad and tragic, exciting.
That's true. It's very well put. Everything after that becomes anticlimactic because it was just such a totally engrossing case and situation in my life.
John Wayne Gacy with Richard Speck, with Bundy, with Dahmer, with all of the serial killers. Most of us know their names, and movies have been made and books have been written because, as twisted as that mindset seems to be, we are wildly enamored. So having a front row seat and spending time with John Wayne Gacy as you did, as he became your client, was there anything throughout any of this where you saw, well, obviously he's a monster. He's got that blinking light coming out of his left ear.
You know, he was a monster to the entire world, and I call it fitting a monster. But to me, he was my client. He was my first client in private practice, and I always looked at him as that. As a person, I probably liked him less and less and less as the case went on, because I was learning more and more about him. More than the murders, he was an extremely manipulative guy. He was probably the world's greatest con artist, and actually he had the ability to manipulate himself. He convinced himself by the time he was executed that he was completely innocent, and he would confess and say he did things at the same time saying he was totally innocent.
John Wayne Gacy was found guilty of 33 murders and was executed in 1994 after 13 years on death row. Sam's book, Defending a Monster, came out in 2011. This is the Theme Machine, and this time it's serial killers. Now we hear from Peter Vronsky, who's a man who's a historian and a filmmaker with a special interest in mass murders. We've included him on the program as he shared a story with me about a chance encounter.
You know, I was just fascinated about the mathematical possibilities of encountering these kinds of monsters walking among us. I was 23 years old, stranded in New York in 1979, and checking into, a hotel that I was unfamiliar with. And this is not New York the way it is today. I had planned on taking a walk through the hotel prior to checking in there. So I'm waiting in the lobby to take the elevator upstairs and walk around. The elevator's not coming down. And I'm waiting, I'm patient. It probably really was maybe 45 seconds, but, you're 23 impatient. When the elevator finally starts coming down, I give the guy on the elevator this hard look, right? You jerk off. How long does it take, to take an elevator down? And so I kind of looked him right in the face. And a normal-looking guy, like a New York guy. The only weird thing about him was that he seemed to have like a sheen of perspiration, and that he didn't really look me in the face. He kind of like walked through me as if I wasn't even there, bumping me on the leg with some kind of soft bag he was carrying, and it felt like he bonked me on the shins with bowling balls were in the bag. And he walked off. I didn't give him another thought afterwards. And so when I go upstairs, take a walk around, immediately I smell like burning paint, and very quickly fire alarms go off. So we have to leave the hotel, and I never end up staying there. The next morning, I read in the newspapers that 2 female torsos with their heads cut off were discovered set afire in that hotel that I was checking into. So I had encountered him as he was essentially fleeing the scene. And so I never thought of the guy in the elevator. Very slowly, as he was apprehended, 6 months later, as he went on trial, it became evident to me like who that was that I had encountered for those 15 seconds.
I was surprised to learn that that term, serial killers, really wasn't anything that was coined in the public until the 80s. Obviously, we had people that were racking up body counts due to mental illness or whatever, but do we find that the ones that are around today that we hang this moniker on, is it different?
I think every society, there's kind of a cocktail of factors, and it's kind of a complex factor, but we see, peaks and surges, for example, in Russia after the fall of communism, in South Africa, for example, in the 2000s and the 90s, there were these huge surges of serial killers. We're seeing surges in China right now. And in the United States, of course, you had that enormous surge between 1970 and 1999. In those 3 decades, 82% 20th century American serial killers made their appearance. That was the moment we coined the term serial killer. It was, the Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer era.
The man Peter encountered in the elevator was later arrested and convicted for a series of particularly heinous killings in downtown New York, giving him the nickname the Times Square Killer. There's several documentaries on his crimes that are currently streaming. Our next couple of excerpts feature medical and law enforcement experts who, between the two, have talked face-to-face with over 100 of these monsters. First up, retired agent from the FBI, John Edward Douglas. He's considered to be the father of criminal profiling. In fact, the main characters on TV's Criminal Minds are actually based on Agent Douglas. He sat across the table from killers like Charles Manson, Ted Bundy, John Gacy, and even Son of Sam killer David Berkowitz. So he's learned much about how a killer thinks, but also the people that are intrigued by them. If you had to profile society's interest, why does it never wane on something so morbid as far as our curiosity?
No, it is. It's really amazing. A lot of people thought this was going to be a passing fancy back in the 90s even, after Silence of the Lambs came out. 90% of the audience are women, and it's pretty much, I think, like what I was interested in, the why plus how equals who. And the same thing goes for the women and who are going to be the victims of these crimes. They really want to know the whys of the behavior of these of these people, and I got to learn that by going into the prisons and conducting extensive interviews throughout my lifetime now.
90% are women? That's a little shocking to me.
It is. It is and it isn't, because they are the victims of these crimes that that I've worked. My unit worked when I was in the bureau, whether it was homicides, whether it was rape cases, molestation cases of various types. So, and they're somewhat of profilers themselves. Are pretty good, and they're interested in knowing really what makes someone tick. Maybe should I date this guy who I'm meeting on the internet through some dating service? What kind of questions should I ask? And I always tell them, I said, well, if you want to ask just one question, kind of ask the question about relationships with the family, and particularly the mother. because most of the people, the violent characters who I've interviewed, it's always been a mother thing. It's a mother who's been passive or totally neglectful to the child, and abandoned the child. And almost without exception, I've seen this with all of the violent offenders who I've interviewed. It doesn't mean that if you have this in your background that everyone's going to turn out this way, but of the ones I interviewed, they certainly had that type of background.
Another thing in advance of our conversation I was thinking about was wondering how you personally felt about Silence of the Lambs, based in part in your work, Mindhunter, which is on Netflix now, based on your work. And there have been other profilers in TVs and movies that have been loosely based on you and what you have developed in your effort to characterize these people. So that kind of puts you on the other end of where you normally sit. How does that feel?
Well, some of the shows are just way off base. I'm not going to mention some of the shows, but the ones where they have the profilers, going out, making the arrest, taking cases away from the police, kicking down the doors, pulling their gun. That's not the way it's done.
Why do you think that you've got cases like Manson and Ted Bundy and Berkowitz, some notorious killers that have been brought to justice, and there are other things like JonBenet Ramsey and Nicole Simpson and Jack the Ripper that all these decades later have gone unsolved?
It's interesting you mention those cases because I was involved in the O.J. Simpson case and a civil case against O.J. Simpson, the JonBenet Ramsey case. Sometimes you just see just some bad police work. You just don't have necessarily the uniformity of how investigations are being conducted. And you get some cops who will come up with a theory and let a theory drive the investigation rather than letting forensic evidence drive the investigation. So, there is that interest. I wrote a book on that, too, Cases That Haunt Us, like the Lindbergh kidnapping case and the Black Dahlia case, Lizzie Borden. There's this fascination. And we're starting to solve many of these cases through DNA now that we didn't have when I first started doing this stuff.
Profiler and New York Times bestselling author John Douglas offers us a new one, The Killer Across the Table. And this looks for particular killers that we really haven't heard of.
Joseph Conjo was different out in Washington State. He killed the children of his friends. Todd Kohlhepp from South Carolina in 2016. They recovered a woman holding captive in a storage container. He killed a total of 7 people. And, of course, you got Donald Harvey in the Midwest. He was an orderly who killed up to as many. We don't have the exact number. We believe it's right around 75 hospital patients when he was an orderly.
When you get access to these guys and you talk to them and you try to draw them out and piece this together, is there one particular line of questioning that's the one you can count on for them to spill the beans, so to speak?
Well, it's really the technique, and you don't see me going in with a tape recorder. You don't see me going in with a pad of paper and a pen. I pretty much studied the case backwards and forwards. I know pretty much everything about the crime, and I want to maintain eye contact with the subject because they're all paranoid. They don't trust anyone, and nor probably should they if they're incarcerated, or should they really even trust me. So by doing this and not relying on self-reporting, meaning that, and that's how it's done today by many psychologists in corrections. They don't want to look at the background of the subject. They just want to rely on self-reporting. And hey, look, these guys will lie to you, and they test you very, very early on to see if you know the case. And with me, they soon find out I know the case, and when they start lying, I don't challenge them. I just kind of laugh. I laugh at them and make light of it. And I'm trying to have a conversation with, not an interrogation, not an interview, just conversation back and forth. They sometimes want to know about me. And I make it a very, very comfortable setting and environment. And it takes a few hours, 4 or 5 hours, but they begin to open up.
That's profiler John Edward Douglas. Another one of the high-profile killers was Ted Bundy. And part of the reason the people found that case so interesting was that he didn't really fit the typical serial killer. He was handsome, charming, polite. Bundy was first arrested in 1975, but later escaped to commit more murders, the last of which were in 1978 at Florida State University, when, while breaking into a sorority house, brutally attacked 4 students. 2 managed to survive, and one of them was Kathy Kleiner-Rubin.
When he entered the sorority house, he first went into one of the sorority rooms, the bedroom, and attacked and killed Margaret Bowman. She was one of the beautiful sorority sisters. She was a senior and just so poised and just wonderful person. He killed her, he strangled her, and then he put the bed sheets up over her neck so it looked like she was sleeping. He then walked across the hall and went to Lisa Levy's room. And at that point, he also strangled her and did other things to her and actually bit her, which was one of the reasons why he was caught and condemned, because he did have that bite mark that matched his teeth.
What interrupted the attack on you?
He was in our bedroom. He attacked me with a piece of firewood, a club, and he attacked me. When he did, he cut a slit in my cheek and hit me. So I was moaning and groaning, and my roommate was right next to me in her twin bed, and she started waking up. So he walked over and attacked her as well. And when I was making more noise, he came back to my side of the room to go ahead, I believe, and kill me, because he left no witnesses and he left no one alive. So when he was attacking me the second time, we had our bedroom windows open, and a car drove in to bring home a sorority sister from a date. When the light shone up in our room, I believe he thought he was seen. At that point, he left our room and ran out of the sorority. So I believe the light shining up in our room was our way of getting rid of Ted Bundy.
I have talked to people that have survived the attacks in 9/11 and ships that sank in the ocean and hostage situations, and a couple of things usually occur with them where there's a dose of survivor's guilt, which is hard to understand if you've not been in that position, but feeling guilty that you made it and so many other victims didn't.
I don't think I ever had that feeling of survivor's guilt. I always felt that I was one of the lucky ones, and I had a chance to live my life and to help other people and enjoy what was ahead of me. My dreams and my thoughts were there to come true.
Your parents, you were in college at the time in Florida, and they encouraged you to move into a sorority for safety reasons, that, strength in numbers, you're going to be better off there. And that's where the attack ended up happening. I would imagine they had a hard time shaking off the guilt.
They did. And to be truth with you, we never really discussed it. I knew that Mom and Dad were going through their own torture inside, and I didn't want to bring it out to them. I just felt bad for them, but I knew I was going to be okay, and I couldn't convey that to them and have it ease their pain.
But there's also the people that cannot get far enough away from the subject matter, and let's tackle the latter one first. I was a little surprised to read that things in Rolling Stone, that all things serial killers and murderers and even Ted's story and his victims still fascinate you today.
Yes, they do. I found to heal myself, I had to learn as much as I could about Ted Bundy. I wanted to know his psyche, what he did. I wanted to make him a person.
What did that do for you in your head?
I found out that it cleared up a lot of the, I'm scared, I don't know what's going on, to I understand who this person was. It was a person, he was evil, and it helped me heal.
You check out the internet, there are Ted Bundy T-shirts and greeting cards, and even before he was put to death, he was a celebrity because he was a good-looking guy and certainly in the news for what he did, but there were women that were madly in love with him, and they were showing up at the court appearances, and even you were being vilified by his followers.
As far as women oohing and awing about him and thinking he was the perfect guy, I believe they had something missing in their lives. I think they weren't in a normal relationship, or something had happened and they felt that they needed to have something to look at, be for, and ooh over, because they were missing something that they didn't have.
Kathy later testified at Bundy's trial in 1979. Her story is in a memoir called A Light in the Dark, Surviving More Than Ted Bundy. Our final clip this time on the Theme Machine is with forensic psychiatrist Dr. Helen Morrison. Her book, My Life Amongst Serial Killers, takes readers on a journey of sit-downs with some of the biggest monsters the world has ever seen, sitting right across from her.
You were the last one to talk to Ed Gein, one of the most notorious serial killers in history, and had unprecedented access to John Wayne Gacy. There were easily books in each of those experiences. Why wait till now and do this one?
I think one of the motives for doing the book was that there has been so much misinformation about what makes a serial killer. There have been theories, there have been thoughts, there have been almost as many theories as there are people about how people turn out this way. I think we're all fascinated by these individuals of how could someone possibly be formed to commit these types of crimes on a repetitive basis. They don't just kill one person. They kill 7, 12, 33 in the Andes in Peru, 100 in Russia, 120. It's not a phenomena that's only the United States. Our society didn't make these people. These people are exactly alike no matter where they live.
Kind of goes against conventional wisdom in your thought that it's a genetic flaw. This is not because they were beaten or neglected as children, or mom and dad, or mom did drugs while she was carrying the child. From the very, very beginning, they were predisposed to this behavior.
And that, I think, was one of the most startling things for the research, that 99.9% of all serial murderers around the world are male, which, common sense makes you think, there must be something in the genetics about this. But is it something with which they're born, that a gene changes, and then later, because they all kill their first victims when they're in their teens, something happens with the brain chemistry and the way all of the systems work together to make this gene suddenly express itself, and how this affects the families of the serial murderers, the mothers, the fathers, the brothers and sisters, the children that they have. If this is something that they all live with, this horrible guilt and this horrible sense of, what did I do something wrong? What did I do wrong? Could I have seen it earlier? And it's nothing that they've done at all.
But if you're stating genetics is involved, then yeah, a parent would be responsible. And why don't we see more second-generation serial killers then?
Right. If it's a genetic mutation, then it's not necessarily passed in among the family. It's just something changes in that gene that relates to how the brain functions during early puberty.
Who was the first one that you talked to? Multiple murderers?
Well, the first serial killer I talked with was Richard Masick, who was also known as the Mad Biter. He was originally arrested for a murder he committed in Wisconsin at a resort. It was a maid. He had a habit of biting his victims. He would bite them and leave extremely distinct teeth patterns, but was so clever that just before he was caught, he had all of his teeth pulled.
Another one you would talk to in Chicago, and one from your neck of the woods, John Wayne Gacy,
yes,
killing almost 30 people. Talk a bit about him. Explain one thing to me, and this really shocked me about you. Even now that we've talked more, I'm a little surprised you have a piece of his brain.
Oh, I have his entire brain.
Okay, why?
Actually, well, it was the first time that I was able to assist at the autopsy following his execution, and he had given me permission to take his brain to study it.
How do you ask someone that?
Well, you just ask them.
You were the last one to talk to Ed Gein, and Ed, the one, basically the basis for a character in Psycho from Alfred Hitchcock. And man skinned a woman and made a suit out of her skin and had an ashtray made of a skull, and really not normal behavior. And here you are, and I bet he wasn't restrained, was he?
Oh, no, of course not. But he was an old man at that time. He came across as a very mild-mannered, little old gray-haired man who did things and acted as if it was the most normal thing in the world.
Would he speak of these things? Would all of these people speak of these things proudly as, look what I've accomplished in my life?
No, it's almost like I went grocery shopping and this is what I bought. It's that cold. It's that unattached. It's that unemotional.
That wraps up another Theme Machine, and there's a lot more where that came from. In fact, tune in for future episodes on the people that bring you true crime each week. Reporters from 2020, Dateline, 48 Hours, and more. Next time, though, it's lots of sex. It's filled our minds since Adam and Eve, and it never left. Join us for visits with a former adult film actor, a Hollywood intimacy coordinator, and look at some of the groundbreaking work of Masters and Johnson, and we can't leave out a visit with the late Dr. Ruth Westhammer. It's sex next time on The Theme Machine. And valuable production assistance from Everett Marshall Creative. New episodes every other week, and make sure you follow The Theme Machine wherever you get your podcasts and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Plus, you can follow us on social media, and all that information is on thethememachine.net. I'm John Carney. Thanks for listening. Be good to each other.